In a world where arrogance often hides behind wealth, one man believed money gave him power over everyone. But when he challenged someone he underestimated, he set the stage for a moment no one would ever forget. Quiet elegance inside the city's most exclusive restaurant, a place where every detail spoke of wealth and refinement. Crystal chandeliers glowed softly overhead, scattering golden light across velvet-draped tables were polished. Silverware gleamed beside half-full glasses of deep red wine. The murmur of conversation flowed like a gentle current, punctuated by laughter that seemed rehearsed, as though even joy here had to be curated. A live jazz trio played in the corner, their music rolling like silk over the room, mingling with the scent of seared steak and expensive perfume. Waiters moved in perfect rhythm, balancing trays with practiced ease, every step a performance. Of silent service. This was the kingdom of the powerful, where wealth was worn not only on wrists and necks, but in posture, in tone, in the invisible certainty that the world bent for them. The hum of comfort shifted the moment the tall glass. Doors opened. A man walked in, trailed by a small entourage, and suddenly the air grew tighter, heavier. He was known here, though not for grace. His presence arrived before he spoke, tailored suit gleaming. Watch flashing under the chandelier's light, every gesture calculated to announce dominance. His laugh was loud, his stride commanding, his eyes scanning the room as if taking inventory of what belonged to him. A few guests nodded politely, others whispered behind their hands, but all noticed. He enjoyed that. This was his stage, and every diner, every waiter, every musician existed only as an audience for his performance of wealth. He made his way to the largest table in the center of the floor, pulling out his chair without waiting for staff to assist. The entourage that followed, friends, business associates, hangers-on filled the seats around him, their own laughter growing louder in an effort to mirror his. Immediately he demanded the most expensive bottle of wine on the list, his voice booming loud enough for several tables to hear. When the waiter hesitated, suggesting another bottle with finer taste, he scoffed and waved a dismissive hand. Bring the most expensive. Always the most expensive. Taste is for the poor. Price is what matters. His companions chuckled, parroting his words, but a few guests nearby exchanged uneasy glances. Still no one dared say a word. In this world, wealth often excused arrogance. Throughout the evening, his arrogance swelled. He mocked the portion sizes of the carefully plated dishes, waving a fork and declaring he could buy the restaurant and fire the chef on a whim. He teased the musicians in the corner, claiming their notes were worth pennies compared to the sound of his own laughter. Waiters bearing trays endured his sharp remarks, their faces tight with restraint. He treated them as props, background figures in his show of power. And for a while, it seemed he held the room in his grip. Some were impressed, nodding at his confidence. Others shrank into silence, their eyes fixed firmly on their plates. He thrived on both, but then his gaze shifted, across the room, weaving. Quietly between tables, a young waitress carried herself with a grace that seemed almost out of place in his eyes. She was efficient yet gentle, balancing glasses with steady hands, her movements so fluid they almost mirrored the music. Her uniform was plain, yet the poise with which she wore it made her seem as if she belonged to another stage entirely. To most, she was simply part of the seamless service, another worker making the night flawless. But to him, she became a target. He leaned back in his chair, smirking, and tapped one of his companions on the shoulder, pointing at her with a tilt of his glass. His voice rose above the hum of conversation. Look at that. They'll let anyone in here these days. Doesn't quite fit, does she? This is a place for elegance, for class. What's she doing pretending to belong? The words reached farther than he intended. Several tables fell silent. The musicians played on, but softer now, as though even the instruments had grown cautious. The waitress, hearing but refusing to react, kept her step steady, her chin lifted with quiet dignity, but her silence only spurred him on. Maybe. She thinks walking with a tray is art. Maybe she thinks service is performance. He chuckled, his entourage following dutifully with laughter that sounded too sharp, too rehearsed. Tell me, could someone like her handle something real? Could she handle sophistication? Could she dance to music that isn't just the clink of glasses? The trio in the corner struck a livelier tune, a rolling wave of jazz filling the room. The millionaire's eyes gleamed as if inspiration had struck. He pushed his chair back slightly, his voice booming with a challenge he knew the entire restaurant would hear. "You there?" he called, pointing directly at the waitress. "Why don't you stop pretending and show us if you belong? Dance. Right here, right now. Let's see if you can handle the rhythm of this place." His smirk widened. "Or is serving tables the only performance you know?" The air fractured into silence. Glasses stopped midair, forks hovered above plates, even the waiters froze in their tracks. The challenge rang out like a bell, sharp and humiliating. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet the waitress's eyes. Others leaned forward, curiosity flickering in their expressions. His entourage broke into laughter, clapping their hands as though this were the finest entertainment of the night. The musicians faltered, their notes stumbling for a beat before regaining strength, as if unsure whether they were accomplices in the scene unfolding. The spotlight was now firmly on her, though she had never asked for it. A woman serving with quiet grace was now thrust into the center of ridicule. Her dignity weighed against the arrogance of a man who thrived on belittling others. She did not flinch, not yet. She continued holding her tray, her eyes lowered just enough to hide the fire beginning to build behind them. Round the room, anticipation hung heavy, waiting for her response. Would she walk away in silence, letting his mockery stand as truth? Would she crumble under the cruel laughter of those too eager to see her fail? Or would she? Something else. The moment stretched, taut, and breathless. The arrogance of wealth had thrown down its dare, and now the entire restaurant leaned into the pause, waiting to see if she would pick it up. For a long-waited moment, she said nothing. The waitress stood in her simple uniform, her tray balanced perfectly in her hand as though the world had not just shifted beneath her feet. Silence clung to her like a shield, and while some might have mistaken it for fear, those who looked closely enough would have seen something else as discipline. Control, a deliberate refusal to let arrogance dictate her worth. She adjusted one of the glasses on her tray with careful precision, her eyes lowered, not in shame, but in choice. Her silence unsettled him more than any words could. He leaned back, stretching his arm across the back of his chair, smiling wider. Confident that she would break eventually, that the heat of 100 watching eyes would scorch her into submission. "Cat got your tongue?" he said, his voice carrying across the hushed tables. The words dripped with mockery, each syllable designed to slice. His entourage erupted with laughter, clapping the table as if they were in on some private joke. One of them leaned over to whisper, loud enough for the room to hear, "Maybe she doesn't understand. Maybe she doesn't even know what real dancing looks like." The laughter swelled again, their voices bouncing off the marble floors and polished wood, filling the silence she had crafted for herself. Yet still she didn't react. Her steps remained steady, her breaths even, her face calm. She moved to another table, setting down a glass of wine with unshaken poise. That composure only sharpened his hunger for attention. The stillness in her, the refusal to crumble, was a kind of defiance he wasn't used to facing. He was a man accustomed to immediate responses, fear, compliance, admiration. Silence unsettled him. Silence stole his spotlight. He raised his glass. "Hi," as though delivering a toast, his words swelling louder, ensuring every soul in the restaurant was forced into his game. "What's the matter? Afraid you'll trip over your own feet? Don't worry, no one expects much." His smirk deepened, his voice curling around the last word like a whip. Some guests tittered nervously, unsure whether to join in his cruelty or to shrink away from it. A few shifted in their seats, eyes darting toward the young woman with faint unease. Whispers began threading through the air. Will she answer him? Is she really just going to take this? Why is he pushing so hard? Curiosity spread like wildfire, mingling with discomfort, while the music stumbled into softer notes. As though the musicians themselves weren't sure whether they were playing for a dinner crowd or a circus. The pressure built like a storm cloud. His entourage leaned forward, eyes sharp with hunger, eager to see the humiliation unfold. They urged him on, whispering lines into his ear, encouraging louder taunts, egging him into greater cruelty. She can't do it. She won't watch. She'll run off. Their words were fuel, and he burned it greedily. He slammed his hand against the table suddenly, making silverware rattle, his voice booming like thunder. Come on, don't waste our time. You've got legs, don't you? Use them. Or maybe you'd rather stay invisible, just another servant in the shadows. His laughter followed, harsh and sharp, cutting into the room's fragile quiet. Eyes turned to her again. Some pitied her. Some waited with cruel anticipation. A few, quiet and thoughtful, looked almost hopeful, as if willing her to rise above this moment, to reclaim something that arrogance had tried to strip away. The spotlight was merciless. Then, after what felt like a lifetime of silence, she stopped. She placed her tray gently onto the nearest table, not with haste, not with anger, but with the same grace that had defined her movements all evening. The clinking of the glasses against the wood was soft, yet in the stillness, it sounded like a bell. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her gaze. For the first time, her eyes locked with his. No fear, no trembling, no hesitation, only calm, steady resolve. The kind of look that does not waver because it does not need to. The smirk faltered, just for a heartbeat. He hadn't expected defiance without noise. He had anticipated tears, anger, excuses, something messy, something he could crush. With more ridicule, instead, her silence had transformed into presence, and presence had power. The room leaned forward, every guest holding their breath. Watching this unspoken battle between arrogance and quiet dignity unfold, she didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She didn't even explain. She simply stepped away from the table, her path measured, her back straight. Each step echoed against the marble floor. Though her shoes made no sound, her movement carried its own weight. A rhythm that resonated louder than any insult he had thrown. Without needing to say a word, she accepted his challenge. Gasps slipped. Through the room, forks dropped against plates. Conversations died. The musicians, sensing something irreversible, had begun. Tightened their playing, the notes gaining energy, as if pulled into the gravity of her decision. Every eye was on her. Now, but not in the way he had imagined. The attention wasn't drenched in ridicule anymore. It was electric, charged with the anticipation of something extraordinary. She stopped in the open space at the center of the restaurant, her hands resting calmly at her sides. Her chin lifted slightly, just enough to claim the air around her. Not boastfully, but with quiet ownership. The man leaned back in his chair, smirk returning, though thinner now, stretched a little too tight. Finally, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Let's see what you've got. Show us if you can do more than serve." His voice dripped with mockery still, but beneath it faintly, there was something else, an edge of unease. He didn't quite recognize. The hush that followed was heavier than before, almost sacred. The audience of strangers became witnesses. The restaurant no longer a place for meals, but a stage for a confrontation neither had chosen, but both now occupied. The band, as if carried by instinct, shifted into a stronger rhythm, the beat pulsing, like a heartbeat daring her to step into it. Guests leaned forward unconsciously, eyes wide, breaths held. It was no longer about his dare. It was about her choice, her courage. It's the way she had turned a cruel game into a moment that belonged only to her. She took one deep breath. The silence broke into music. The stage was set. And while the man sat smirking, convinced this would end in her embarrassment, the rest of the room felt something different. They didn't know why, not yet. But a quiet certainty stirred inside them. They were about to witness something unforgettable. The first note rose like a spark in the air, low and steady, curling around the room with the intimacy of a secret. The trio in the corner found a rhythm, their instruments speaking louder now, as though sensing destiny had asked them to bear witness. All eyes fixed on her, the young waitress standing in the center of the polished floor, framed by golden chandeliers, and the hush of anticipation. She stood still at first, the silence within her deeper than the music. Letting the weight of the moment gather like breath before a leap, Then she moved. It began subtly, almost invisibly, a sway of the shoulders that bent perfectly with the curve of the saxophone. Her feet brushed the floor in a rhythm so quiet it seemed she wasn't stepping at all but gliding, as if the ground itself had softened beneath her. Yet a hush deepened. Guests leaned forward, glasses forgotten, conversations stilled mid-sentence. Laughter of arrogance had drained from the room entirely. Something else was happening now, something that no one had expected. Her arms lifted, not in grand gestures, but in deliberate arcs, fluid and precise, painting the air with invisible colors. Each motion seemed born from the music, not forced. Upon it, as though she had been waiting all her life for this very song to call her into being. The trio, stunned, followed her rather than leading, adjusting their tempo to her rhythm. The piano softened into velvet chords. The drums whispered like a heartbeat. The saxophone cried like a soul remembering joy. Her movements told a story, one unspoken yet universally understood. Every step was dignity reclaimed, every turn a refusal. To bow to humiliation, she spun with grace, the plain black of her uniform catching light in ways that made it shimmer like silk. Her feet tapped sharp against the floor, echoing like punctuation marks in poetry. Then she stilled, body bent in a shape that held power and fragility in the same breath. And the audience exhaled together, realizing they had been holding there, breathed with her. Gasps broke out when she suddenly leapt, a motion so effortless it defied gravity. She landed in silence, balanced, her head tilted as though listening to something only she could hear. The music rose faster now, and she followed, no longer contained by hesitation, but exploding into motion. Her body bent and swayed, her hands slicing through air, her steps quick, playful, daring. She was no longer a waitress bound to trays and tables. She was a dancer commanding the floor, pulling every soul in the room into the rhythm that poured from her veins. The guests began to react in ways they hadn't planned. A woman near the front table placed her hand over her mouth, eyes wide with awe. A man who had once chuckled with the Millionaire now leaned forward, completely still, his gaze locked in wonder. Even the waitstaff, standing along the edges of the room, forgot their duties for a moment, drawn to the brilliance unfolding in the space they usually navigated quietly. It was as if the entire restaurant had shifted from luxury to sanctuary, the air thick with reverence. And the Millionaire? At first, his smirk clung stubbornly to his face as though plastered there by arrogance. But minute by minute it cracked. His laughter, forced and strained, faltered as her movements grew bolder. His glass froze halfway to his lips. His entourage's chuckles died, their eyes darting between him and the woman now spinning like fire across the floor. He had set a trap for humiliation, but it was he who found himself ensnared. Every flick of her wrist, every deliberate step stripped him of power. She wasn't merely dancing, she was dismantling his arrogance, piece by piece, without ever touching him. Then it happened. She paused mid-motion, the music dropping into a softer beat, and for a brief second, she turned her head toward him. Her eyes locked with his, not in challenge, not in mockery, but with something far more devastating, complete serenity. She did not need to prove herself. She did not need to defeat him. She simply was. That gaze lasted no more than a breath, but it undid him more thoroughly than any insult could. His smirk melted. His fingers tightened around his glass until the wine trembled. His face, usually so sure, flushed with a discomfort he could not hide. The song swelled again, and she moved into her final sequence. Faster now, her feet tapping a rhythm sharp and clean, her arms extending like wings, her body spinning with such control it seemed she might dissolve into the music itself. Guests clapped softly at first, then louder, following her rhythm, their hands echoing her heartbeat. Some even rose from their seats, unable to contain the energy she had ignited. The trio matched her crescendo, the saxophone wailing like fire, the drums rattling with joy, the piano cascading in rivers of sound. She was not simply dancing, she was leading them all. Every person in the room carried within her rhythm, and then silence. She stopped on a single note, her body frozen in. perfect stillness. One arm extended, one foot pointed lightly on the polished marble. The music cut with her, ending sharp, as though the band had rehearsed the moment 1,000 times, though it had been pure instinct. For a heartbeat, the restaurant was utterly silent. The chandelier's crystals swayed softly, scattering light, and the air felt electric, as though everyone present had witnessed something sacred. Then came the sound. Applause burst like thunder. Chairs scraped back as guests rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some shouting her name, though they had never known it until tonight. Tears shone in eyes unaccustomed to vulnerability. Strangers who had dined, in polished distance, leaned toward each other, united by awe. The musicians grinned openly, sweat shining on their foreheads, knowing they had been part of something unforgettable. Even the waitstaff clapped, some smiling through tears. Their pride overflowing, she did not bask. She did not bow extravagantly. She lowered her arms slowly, breathing steady, her expression calm, humble, almost detached. With a small nod toward the musicians, she stepped back, her body returning to the same grace she had carried when she first walked between tables. So nothing extraordinary had happened at all. She turned and began to walk back toward her tray. Her posture tall, her steps measured, her presence leaving behind a silence more powerful than applause. But the applause continued. The sound shook the walls, louder and louder, chasing her retreat. She had claimed the room without demanding it, without seeking it, without arrogance. And in that quiet dignity, she had given them all something money could never buy: beauty born from truth, strength born from humility, power born from grace. And in the center of it all, the man who had dared her sat frozen, his smirk gone, his face pale. His hand trembled around his glass, the wine inside, rippling like a storm-tossed sea. For the first time in memory, he had no words, no laughter, no control. The trap he had laid had become his undoing, and the entire room knew it. The echoes of applause still trembled through the chandeliers long after her final step. Even as she walked back toward the tray she had set down earlier, the clapping refused to die, rolling through the room in waves, refusing to release her. The sound was no longer just appreciation, it was reverence, gratitude for being granted a moment they knew they would never forget. Strangers turned to each other, smiling, shaking their heads in disbelief, murmuring words like extraordinary, brilliant, unreal. Some dabbed their eyes, ashamed of tears in such a place, but unable to stop them. The musicians had set their instruments aside, standing and clapping themselves, exchanging grins that spoke of honor. It had been their stage, but tonight she had claimed it effortlessly. She picked up the tray again, her hands steady, her face serene. She did not bow, did not wave, did not linger in the glow of the spotlight she had never asked for. She returned to her work as though she had simply delivered another glass of wine, moving between tables with the same quiet grace as before. That humility silenced even the most cynical hearts. She had turned the room upside down and then simply resumed her place, needing no fanfare to prove her worth. That more than the dance itself struck them deeply. But at the center table, the man who had dared her sat frozen, his chest tight, his jaw clenched. His entourage, once loud and eager, had fallen into silence, their eyes darting nervously toward him, as if afraid of the storm that might erupt. Yet no storm came. He could not summon it. His usual arsenal, mockery, laughter, scorn lay useless in the face of what they had all witnessed. His glass shook slightly in his hand, the red wine inside rippling like blood under his trembling grip. He tried to smile, tried to chuckle, but the sound died in his throat, weak and hollow. Around him, guests who had once chuckled at his jokes now leaned away, their faces cool, their admiration evaporated. The tables nearest his own looked at him with thinly veiled contempt. To them, his arrogance now seemed smaller, almost pitiful, exposed for the empty theater it was. His wealth could no longer shield him. Money could purchase applause, but it could not force awe. Tonight, awe had been earned by someone he had mocked, and the sting of it seared him deeper than he could admit. He muttered something, a weak attempt to dismiss what had happened, Not bad for a waitress, he said under his breath, forcing a smirk, but the words sounded brittle, ridiculous even to his own companions. No one laughed, and not one of them dared echo him this time. They sat stiffly, their silence louder than any rebuke. For the first time in years, he was utterly alone. In a crowded room, she passed by his table once more, her steps calm, her eyes never lowering. She did not look at him, did not offer him the satisfaction of acknowledgement. That dismissal burned more fiercely than any insult she could have spoken. She had rendered him invisible in the very place where he had demanded to be the brightest flame. His power, his dominance, had been stripped away with nothing but grace. The applause slowly softened into murmurs, conversations re-emerging, but with a new tone, lighter, warmer, alive. Guests leaned across tables, sharing their disbelief at what they had seen, recounting each leap, each spin, each impossible moment, as though telling the story would anchor it more firmly in memory. Strangers who had never spoken before toasted each other, bonded by the miracle of what they had witnessed. The restaurant itself seemed changed, its opulence suddenly less about chandeliers and wine, and more about the memory of a young woman's quiet triumph. The waitstaff returned to their duties with renewed energy, stealing glances of pride at the one who had just redefined what it meant to carry dignity in silence. Some exchanged small smiles, their eyes bright. They had known her strength all along, though perhaps not the full extent. Tonight, the world knew. The man remained at his table, shrinking as the room grew brighter around him. His arrogance had always fed on attention, but now the attention belonged wholly to her, and it was clear it would not return to him. He shifted in his seat, tugging at his cufflinks, muttering to his companions, "Dot," but they no longer responded with the eager obedience he expected. They nodded vaguely, their eyes drifting elsewhere, unwilling to tether themselves to a man stripped so publicly of pride at last. He rose abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the marble. The sound cut across the room, drawing brief glances, but no one cared long enough to linger. He threw a handful of bills on the table, as though money could cover the silence that followed him, then turned sharply toward the door. His stride, usually so commanding, now looked too fast, too uneven, as if he couldn't escape quickly enough. The first time his departure felt small, almost unnoticed, swallowed by the hum of a restaurant that no longer revolved around him. Meanwhile, she continued her work, pouring wine, setting down plates. Moving with quiet confidence, unchanged, and yet forever transformed in the eyes of those who watched. She did not need to remind anyone of what she had done. They would remember for the rest of their lives. The narrator's voice would close it all, not in thunder, but in truth. He believed power was measured in wealth, that dignity could be mocked, that worth could be purchased. But in one night, with nothing more than silence, courage, and grace, she proved him wrong. True power does not demand attention. True power commands it without ever asking. And when arrogance dared her to dance, she did not just rise to the challenge. She transformed it into a moment none of them would ever forget. The music began again in the corner, softer this time, no longer background, but tribute. The guests raised their glasses, not to wealth, not to arrogance, but to dignity, to resilience, to beauty that could not be bought. And at the heart of it all, a woman in a simple uniform moved quietly through the tables, carrying herself with the kind of grace that could silence cruelty, humble pride, and remind the world that greatness often hides in the unlikeliest places till the right moment calls it into the light.